everyone, and welcome back to Ancient History Jewelry Stories, your favorite niche history podcast. This episode is part 2 of the series that we started earlier this month about the stolen French crown jewels. If you have not listened to or watched part 1, please go back and do that first, because I lay down the groundwork for the history of the stolen French crown jewels, how the theft occurred, how the stones were recovered, and I discussed 3 of the larger stolen diamonds. For those of you who are listening to this on Spotify or your favorite podcast listening platform, this is, once again, a video episode as well. If you would like to watch the video version, you can also find that on Spotify, or you can find it on YouTube. My channel name is moonhoney.jewelry. I seem to have backed myself into a bit of a corner with these video episodes, and I do believe this is going to be the format going forward. So for every future episode, just assume there's also a video version unless I say otherwise. I'm going to spare you all of the plugs and explanations in the hopes that you have already listened to part 1. If not, pause this right here, listen to part 1, and then come back. So I won't tell you who I am, what we're doing here, or tell you where to find me until the end of the episode. In part 1, we talked about the Regent, the Sancy, and the Hortensia diamonds, and in this episode, part 2, we're going to be talking about one more diamond and 2 other gemstones. We're going to be talking about one of the most famous diamonds in the world, what we now know as the Hope diamond, but which was known as the French blue when it was stolen, and we're going to be talking about the Grand Sapphire and the Côte de Bretagne spinel, 2 stones that look positively edible. This episode is being published a week later than usual. I took the week off last week because it was my birthday on Friday. I am a chronic rule follower, so I gave myself the birthday gift of breaking my own rules. For those of you who have been waiting patiently since last Wednesday, I hope this episode was worth it. I hinted in the last episode that I have strong opinions about the Hope diamond. In fact, I think I might have called it ugly. In a vacuum, it is still a pretty astonishing stone, but many of you, including those who know its history, agreed with my assessment that it's fairly lackluster. Why do I think I have the right to say that the Hope diamond is kinda ugly and not very exciting? Well, let's get into it, shall we? In its current form, the Hope diamond is an irregular oval-shaped, 45.52 carat, deep blue diamond. It is in the collection of the Smithsonian at their Museum of Natural History, and it is their showpiece. If you visit their gem collection, the Hope diamond is guaranteed to have a crowd around it. The stone was donated to the museum in the 1960s by the jeweler Harry Winston, and it has been one of the major draws of their gem collection ever since. But it has a long, broad, and intriguing history that a lot of people are simply completely unaware of. You might be wondering why I'm even bringing this up in a podcast about the stolen French crown jewels. And that is because, if you haven't guessed by now, it is one of the stolen French crown jewels. When this was stolen in 1792, it would not have been known as the Hope diamond. It was originally known as the French blue. In fact, that's not even its first name. Before being known as the French blue, it was known as the Tavernier blue. The Tavernier blue, named after Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, an adventurer and gem merchant, weighed an incredible 112 carats. That is a very large blue diamond. This stone came from India, most likely from the Kollur mines in Golconda, and as I mentioned in the previous episode, diamonds from the Golconda region of India are generally known for being perfectly clear with very few inclusions. That was definitely true of the original Tavernier blue diamond. Most likely brought to France from India by Jean-Baptiste Tavernier in 1666, it was originally described as being a beautiful violet color. At this point in the 17th century, violet was used to describe various shades of blue, so this is not a purple stone, but a deep blue color. It was cut in a table cut, a fairly crude table cut, irregular and asymmetrical, and it was described as having perfect clarity. This table cut, with its very large facets, was not intended to create sparkle or bounce light out of the stone, but instead to enhance and maximize this perfect clarity. Tavernier sold this massive diamond to Louis XIV in 1668, along with 14 other diamonds. And in 1673, Louis XIV had it recut by his court jeweler, Pitau, into an incredibly unusual and what we now know to be very beautiful shape. This is when the stone took on its new name, the French blue versus the Tavernier blue, no longer belonged to Tavernier. Cut down from 112 to just over 67 carats, it was now an 8-sided shield shape with one very unusual and very beautiful feature. Instead of having a pointed bottom, a culet, like so many diamonds do, the back of the stone was cut into a 7-rayed star pattern. Just chiming in real quick while I edit this episode, I said star pattern, that was a mistake, it's a sun pattern, and also apparently I cannot count. The French blue had 7 sides, not 8. Louis XIV was known as the Sun King, and this star pattern was intended to create almost a window through which you could see through the stone. When set into gold, this window would have given the illusion of the 7-rayed sun pattern being golden, like the metal behind it. A royal inventory from this time describes the stone as being an intense steely blue. And as I said, it became known as the French blue or the blue diamond of the crown. Most people do know it as the French blue, and it's less wordy, so we're going to stick with that name. Initially, this was not made into an elaborate piece of jewelry. It was set in gold to create that beautiful golden sun pattern in the back, but it was worn suspended from a ribbon. Louis XIV would wear this around his neck, but it seems he did not wear it very often. I do rather like the image of Louis XIV wearing this thing on a ribbon around his neck like a cat with a bell. This diamond, along with all of the other French crown jewels, was inherited by Louis XV, and in 1715, he had the diamond set into an insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece. The Order of the Golden Fleece is a chivalric order which still exists today, and Louis XV was a member. This insignia, which was a very large and rather elaborate piece of jewelry, was not really worn very often. In fact, it was intended more as a symbol of power, which is what made it such a tempting thing to steal in 1792. It also contained one of the other stones that we're going to be talking about later in the episode, the Côte de Bretagne spinel. While we do not have the original insignia because it was stolen and dismantled, we do have many replicas, and there are very detailed sketches of it that survive. Not only sketches of the finished piece, but preliminary sketches made by the court jeweler in order for Louis XV to decide on the final design. Interestingly, one of these preliminary sketches shows the French blue diamond, and another one shows what would have most likely been yet another one of the stones we're talking about in this episode, the Grand Sapphire, cut down in order to fit. Because Louis XV went for the design with the blue diamond, the Grand Sapphire was allowed to maintain its original and unusual shape, which is actually quite similar to the Tavernier blue before it was cut, but we'll get to that in a little bit. After this insignia was stolen along with the other French crown jewels, it went missing, completely dropped off the radar. Unlike so many of the other French crown jewels that were very swiftly recovered, the insignia was most likely completely dismantled and melted down. Some of its other parts were recovered pretty swiftly. I can't speak to the smaller diamonds that would have been set into the sheath or the other large diamond at the top of this piece, but the Hope diamond went missing completely. There was no trace of it, and curiously, there doesn't seem to have been much of an effort made to recover it. At this time, colored diamonds were considered to be far less valuable than clear diamonds, which we now know is stupid, because colored diamonds are far more valuable, far more rare, and a perfectly clear and deeply colored blue diamond of this quality is definitely more valuable than any of the colorless diamonds in the French crown jewels. The next clue we have about this missing French blue diamond is in 1812. It pops up in London with the name of Eliasson's diamond, named for a diamond dealer, Daniel Eliasson. It no longer weighs 67 carats. It now weighs just over 45 carats, but the color is suspiciously similar. Curiously, this diamond pops up in London 2 days after the 20-year statute of limitations on crimes committed during the French Revolution runs out. A coincidence? Probably not. It's pretty immediately suspected that this new diamond on the market was the recut French blue, but of course, nobody had any proof or evidence. There's even some rumors that in the intervening 20 years, the French blue ended up in the possession of the English King George IV, a man who notoriously had many debts and had to sell off quite a few royal jewels in order to cover them, this stone included. Now, I have no proof to back this story up, but it is tantalizing. After this blue stone showed up in London in 1812, it disappears again for a little while, and at this point, you might be asking, why do we call it the Hope Diamond? Good question. Thank you for the easy transition. In 1839, this shows up in the collection of Henry Philip Hope, a British banker and gem collector. Hope is a much more romantic and memorable name than Eliasson, so I am not surprised that that's the one that stuck. From here, we have a pretty clear chain of possession all the way until this stone gets donated to the Smithsonian. So there aren't really any mysteries about what happened to this diamond in the next century and a half. But there is still this big question mark of, was this the missing French blue? And while that question was eventually answered, and answered pretty definitively, we're not going to get to that until well into the 21st century. Until then, this stone changes hands quite a few times. Henry Philip Hope left the diamond to his widow Anne upon his death. She chooses to leave it to her grandson, Lord Francis Hope, instead of her own son. Anne feared that her son, who was not good with money, would end up selling the diamond in order to cover debts. She felt that her grandson would be a better custodian for this diamond, although ironically, that's exactly what happened to Lord Francis Hope. Anne's grandson did end up having to sell the diamond in order to cover debts. From here, it pops up in the possession of Adolph Weil, a diamond merchant in New York City in 1902, then into the hands of another diamond merchant, Simon Frankel, also in New York City. In 1908, it gets sold to Selim Habib, a Turkish diamond collector. And very shortly after, in 1909, it ends up in the hands of a gem dealer named Simon Rosenau. 1 year later, it's in the possession of Cartier. And Cartier goes on to sell it to one of its most famous owners, the American socialite Evelyn Walsh McLean. She was, by all accounts, the most fun owner of this diamond. It is said that she wore the Hope Diamond to go lobster fishing, wore it on roller coasters, and attached it to the collar of her Great Dane. She scandalized the entire world with the casual way in which she enjoyed this large blue diamond. And in 1949, it ends up in the possession of the jeweler Harry Winston. They would go on to donate it to the Smithsonian in 1967, and that is where it's been ever since. So how can I so confidently tell you that the Hope Diamond is the recut French blue? Well, we do have proof. In the early 2000s, while doing an inventory of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, something very unusual was found: a lead model of a faceted stone. This was initially incorrectly labeled as being a lead model of a stone from the Portuguese crown jewels, but the director of the museum at the time recognized it for what it was. This was an exact lead replica of the missing French blue. There had been sketches and drawings of the French blue, but up until now, there had been no replica. I've actually seen this lead model in person. I made a pilgrimage to the National Museum of Natural History when I was in Paris last October, specifically to see this little lead model. It doesn't look like much when you see it in person. It's just a dull little lead blob, but it's been instrumental in determining whether or not the Hope could have been the French blue. In 2012, this little lead model was used to create a perfect digital recreation, and it was this digital model that allowed researchers to determine that the Hope Diamond was definitely cut from the French blue. There are diagrams where you can see how the Hope fits perfectly into the French blue and exactly how it would have been cut. Which leads me to my most important point in telling this story. The Hope Diamond is a hack job. It was cut entirely in an effort to obfuscate its origins. It was not cut to beautify, and it was not cut by someone who really knew what they were doing. It was cut awkwardly. The proportions of the stone are not very beautiful. It's asymmetrical. The facets don't look so great. And worse than that, it has lost so much of its fire and sparkle because of how it had to be cut out of the French blue. One of the most distinctive features of the French blue that had to be removed in order to hide it was that beautiful 7-rayed sun pattern on the back. They had to chop the entire back of the stone off and remove evidence of all 8 sides of the shield shape. Diamonds, when cut by a skilled diamond cutter, are cut in a way that enhances the color of the stone, increases the scintillation, which is the glittering effect that you see when the facets bounce light around, and generally maximizes the beautiful aesthetic properties of the diamond. The Hope did none of those things. Whoever got their hands on this stone and chopped it up in order to hide it was probably trying to keep it as large as possible, but did the stone no favors in terms of aesthetic value. And like I said at the beginning of the episode, if you see this at the Smithsonian, it is still awe-inspiring, just by virtue of being an incredibly large, incredibly blue diamond. But it doesn't really have any depth to it. The stone looks kind of dull, the color is a bit dead, and it certainly would not be described as a beautiful violet color or of perfect clarity by anyone who sees it today. Furthermore, the new setting that it was put into by Harry Winston in the early 20-teens is hideous. I think this is a stone that deserves to be displayed with no setting or mounting whatsoever. At least then you could appreciate it as the incredibly rare specimen that it is. And it's not like I think the Cartier setting that it was originally in when it went to the Smithsonian was that much better, but the new Harry Winston setting really is just very much of its time, already looks outdated, and does not help elevate this already butchered blue diamond. So we've gone down from 112 carats to just over 67 carats to just over 45 carats. And of course, this leads us to ask, what happened to the rest of the diamond? Are there bits and pieces of the Hope diamond lying around in the form of other, smaller diamonds? For a very long time, it was suspected that there might have been usable fragments of the French blue and even the Tavernier blue when they were cut down. Two diamonds that had been touted as being potential sister stones to the Hope are the Brunswick blue and the Peary diamond. Unfortunately, neither of those seem to exist in the modern world, and if they do, we don't know where they are. Furthermore, studies done by the GIA, the Gemological Institute of America, have concluded that there almost definitely weren't any usable fragments of the stone from either cutting. With the knowledge of how diamonds would have been cut when the Tavernier blue was turned into the French blue, and when the French blue was hacked into the Hope diamond, it becomes pretty obvious that there was no way for usable fragments to remain. We're not going to get too much into how diamonds are faceted, I have covered that in previous podcast episodes, but diamonds can be shaped in one of two ways: cleaving and grinding. Knowing what we know now about the dimensions of the stone in all three of its forms, it's pretty unlikely that any pieces were cleaved off that were large enough to cut into other diamonds, and it's more likely that the surfaces were ground down, leaving behind nothing but diamond dust. And since the Brunswick blue and the Peary diamonds are nowhere to be found, there's not really any good way to test them against the Hope diamond. I can hear some of you out there screaming, but what about the curse? I don't believe in cursed stones. I'm not even going to disrespect this diamond by getting into a supposed curse. There is no such thing as a cursed gem. It's a great marketing tactic, but it's not a real thing. If you want to learn about the curse of the Hope diamond, you're going to have to do that independent research without me. Very sorry. I think these gemstones are interesting enough with their actual histories. Interesting enough because these come out of the earth. This is something formed by nature and geology, that I'm not going to go down the undignified path of talking about made-up curses. The last thing I will talk about, though, are these incredibly beautiful cubic zirconia replicas of the Tavernier blue, the French blue, and the Hope diamond made by the Smithsonian. These three replicas are an incredible illustration of all three forms that this diamond has taken. The Tavernier blue, clearly cut in order to enhance the clarity of this stone. The French blue, cut into that unusual and beautiful shield shape with the 7-rayed sun pattern in the back. And the Hope diamond, an awkward little ostrich egg next to these two other beautiful and distinctive cuts. These three replicas are a great illustration of why I can confidently tell you that I think the Hope diamond is actually quite ugly. Looking at these also makes me very sad that we'll never get to see the Hope as the French blue, because it was quite obviously a beautifully cut diamond. It did lose quite a few carats when cut down from the Tavernier blue, but it was done so in an effort to beautify a diamond and maximize its best qualities, which is truly what lapidary and stone cutting should aim for. The other two stones that we're going to talk about in the rest of this episode don't have as much information behind them, but they're both very intriguing stones, especially in terms of their unusual cuts, and both of them are related to this over-the-top insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Up next, we are talking about a sapphire. This is known as the Grand Sapphire, sometimes mistakenly referred to as the Ruspoli Sapphire, but that is actually an entirely different and unrelated stone. The Grand Sapphire was added to the French crown jewels in 1669, right around the time that the Tavernier Blue was acquired, so of course it was also purchased by King Louis XIV. It is possible that Louis XIV acquired the sapphire from Tavernier, but there are no records indicating who this sapphire might have been purchased from, which does hint at the fact that it may have been a gift and not a purchase. Weighing 135.74 carats, it is cut into a very intriguing lozenge shape. It has 6 sides, and I can't help but think it looks like a blue Jolly Rancher. I want to taste this thing so bad. I'm guessing it's blue raspberry flavor. This 6-sided lozenge shape is also referred to as a rhombic parallelepiped. As I mentioned when discussing the Hope Diamond, there were 2 sketches made for that crazy insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece, one containing a blue diamond, and the other containing 2 sapphires. When Louis XV commissioned this piece, he did specify that the stones to be used were to come from the existing French crown jewels, which makes it very likely that the larger sapphire would have been cut from the Grand Sapphire. Because Louis XV went with the design with the blue diamond, the Grand Sapphire was allowed to keep its rhombic parallelepiped shape. While some sources claim that it was initially set in gold, the amount of gold that it's inventoried with is very small, just over 2 grams, which is truly not a large amount of gold for such a large stone. It's far more likely that instead of a setting, this sapphire had a small stand made out of gold filigree, which was a style that Louis XIV was incredibly fond of. The geometric shape of the sapphire would have made it easier to balance on a small filigree stand. This was probably appreciated more as a large specimen of a sapphire versus worn as a piece of jewelry. In 1791, the sapphire was appraised at 1 million livres. Adjusted for inflation, that comes to over $2 million today. Then, of course, the next year, in 1792, it was most likely stolen with the rest of the French crown jewels. It is a little unclear whether or not the stone was actually stolen, but an inventory made immediately after the theft does not list any remaining sapphires. So whether or not it was stolen with the rest of the crown jewels, it definitely was not there after the theft. Interestingly, the sapphire was donated to the National Museum of Natural History in Paris pretty soon after the theft, so that means it had to have been found pretty quickly. It was donated in 1796, and that's most likely because the shape of the sapphire was thought to be naturally occurring. We know now that this is not a naturally occurring sapphire crystal. This had to have been cut, most likely in India, but at the time it was thought that this was a natural sapphire crystal that had simply had its facets polished. Modern analysis of the Grand Sapphire indicates that it came from Sri Lanka, although the cut indicates that it made its way to France from India. This is why some theorize that Louis XIV got the stone from Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, because there simply weren't that many gem dealers bringing stones back from India. Its cut is also remarkably similar to the Tavernier Blue. This beautiful geometric table cut with very large facets, intended to show off the clarity of the stone versus create sparkle. When you put the Grand Sapphire next to models of the Tavernier Blue, the similarities are striking. The colors and the cuts would have been fairly similar, although the Tavernier Blue was asymmetrical. This stone is still at the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, and although I did get to see it when I was there, I, for whatever reason, did not think to take videos or photos. It looks just as tasty in person, and if you can look at this stone without wanting to lick it, you have far more self-control than I do. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all we know about it, but we are fortunate that it was allowed to keep its original geometric table cut. This is such an unusual cut, especially for a large, very fine sapphire. So many stones like these have been recut and refashioned over the intervening centuries that this stone becomes a true curiosity. And now we have one stone left to discuss, another stone that I desperately want to put in my mouth, the Côte de Bretagne spinel. This is one of my favorite carved gemstones. This, as the name suggests, is a spinel, although for quite a while it was thought to be a ruby, not uncommon with red spinels. This is also one of the oldest gems in the French crown jewels. It now exists as a 105 carat carving of what is described as a reclining or recumbent dragon. but it was initially a 214-carat stone hailing from Pakistan. It had a lovely three-pointed shape, again, a geometric table cut very similar to both the Tavernier Blue and the Grand Sapphire, and it originally belonged to Anne de Bretagne, which is where it gets his name. She was the wife of Louis XII. This stone was pawned numerous times, going in and out of royal hands, until it was eventually cut into this beautiful dragon shape by Louis XV in 1750. As you may have noticed from the reproductions and sketches of that insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece, this beautiful carved dragon featured prominently in that over-the-top piece of jewelry. Set so that the dragon was facing downward, it was one of the focal points of the insignia, and while the insignia was dismantled and probably melted down for its gold, the dragon was recovered intact. I suppose it would have been too difficult to cut this dragon down in a way that would have hidden its origins, unlike the Hope Diamond. This piece was recovered shortly after its theft in 1792, of course having been pried from its golden fleece insignia, and it resides with the rest of the French crown jewels at the Galerie d'Apollon at the Louvre. Some people visit the Louvre with the hopes of seeing the Mona Lisa. I visited the Louvre with the hopes of seeing the Côte de Bretagne spinel. I spent quite a bit of time looking at it, and I have come to the conclusion that it's most likely strawberry flavored. Disappointingly, despite being maybe the oldest gem in the French crown jewels, it has so little history that we can actually talk about. Despite knowing that it came from Pakistan and that it was pawned and sold and resold multiple times over, there really isn't much documentation that we can talk about. I'm going to have to be content with showing you this picture once again and asking you to please consider, what flavor do you think this gummy dragon is? And with that, we come to the end of my discussion of the stolen French crown jewels, and my very strong opinions on the Hope Diamond and the various potential flavors of colored gemstones. So often, when these sorts of pieces are stolen, they're never found again. And although people had their suspicions, for a very long time, the French blue was considered to be gone for good. Now that we know that the Hope Diamond is the recut French blue, and it gives me an opportunity to bitch about how I think it is really not very attractive, we can say that most of the significant stones of the French crown jewels were in fact recovered. Now, the government of France did end up selling off quite a bit of their royal treasures at the end of the 19th century, so once again, many of those jewels have left their coffers, but the ones that do remain are very beautiful, have a lot of history to them, and are absolutely worth taking a look at if you get a chance to visit the Louvre. And if you do find yourself in Paris, definitely make a trip to the National Museum of Natural History. It's composed of multiple buildings, including an incredible paleontology museum, and the gemstone building is rather small, but it contains some delightful treasures, including a few gems that belong to Marie Antoinette. I spared you the plugs at the beginning of the episode, so I'm going to give them to you all now. If you love my podcast and you'd like to watch my video series, mostly shorter videos, under 3 minutes, you can find those on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under the username moonhoney.jewelry. You can find me on Facebook under Moonhoney Jewelry. You can find the jewelry that I make, always inspired by history and using mostly ancient techniques, at shopmoonhoney.com. If you want some merch, perhaps a tote bag that says the best thing Napoleon ever did was buy Josephine all that jewelry, you can also find those at shopmoonhoney.com by navigating to the Ancient History Jewelry Stories page. If you enjoy my content and you find value in what I do, perhaps it inspires you, perhaps it has led you to do your own research or find your own love of ancient history and, of course, ancient jewelry, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can join me at patreon.com/ancient history jewelry stories. There are a few different tiers of membership where you get different benefits. One of those being a shout out to all of my paid Patreon members. Once again, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening or watching. And as always, I will see you in a few weeks for more ancient history jewelry stories. And now it's time to give a shout out to my paid Patreon members. This list keeps growing. I feel so fortunate to have you all supporting me. I love you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for being along for this ride. Forgive me for looking down at the list to read this time. It's starting to get a little bit uncanny when I stare into the camera every time I say a name. So a huge, huge, heartfelt thank you to Patty Crocker, Martha Garcia, Teresa Hansen, Carrie, Kat Peterson, Sarah Hackett, Marianne, Michael D. Clifford, Sarah Pounders, Anne-Marie Nichols, Miranda Schaefer, Lindsay Breeze, Sarai, Laura Hastings Brownstein, Tiff, Susanna Ress, Uncle Mike and Aunt Jody, hi guys, Jason Russ, Molly, Rivka McCormack, Dilara Özkardeşler, That's my sister. Love you. Kate, Deborah Hansen, Armored Chocobo, Jennifer Moshier, Julie Spradley, Emma J. Makes, Mary Lee, Flying Chef, Liz Bouchette, Erin Atkinson, Michelle Dunphy, Bree S., Connor, Magda Chope, Catherine Elizabeth, Beth, Stannis Fluoride, Megan Rose Thomas, Mimi Fondren, Bonnie Glass, Colsey Tucker, Mink Rose, Jennifer Crosscree, Amy Radner, and Jennifer Baker. Some of you have been here since day one. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for helping to allow me to continue doing what I love.